In the last video, which I recorded earlier today, I said this is the last video in this series on idealism, physicalism, and dualism. Well, psych, that turns out not to be true because I wanted to make one more video and address the interaction problem. As I said in the first video, I think all three worldviews, idealism, naturalism, and dualism, each have a problem. So if you're an idealist, you have to deal with the problem of solipsism. If you're a physicalist, you have the hard problem of consciousness. And if you're a substance dualist, then you have the interaction problem. And the interaction problem is the problem of explaining how it is that two things that seem to have nothing in common with each other are somehow able to have causal interaction. So, for example, the physical world has causal interaction over the mind, which is how you're able to use your sensory organs to acquire perceptions. If you're new to the channel, the whole reason I started this whole series is to help me be able to speak better. And as you can see, I'm not a very good speaker. Like whenever I'm speaking, my mind has a much more difficult time functioning than when I'm just thinking or writing. So I'm trying to overcome that. So please excuse me if I have these long pauses sometimes when I'm trying to think of a word or I'll use the wrong word. So anyway, back to the subject. So according to substance dualism, the direction of causation goes both ways. Physical things can cause mental things, which is how we're able to sense the outside world. But mental things can also have causal influence over physical things, which is how we're able to behave based on our desires. That's how we're able to do anything on purpose. And so, but if this causal thing happens in both directions, then how does it happen? Descartes, this problem kind of arose because of the way Descartes framed the mind-body problem. He said that the mind is a non-physical thinking thing, and the brain is a physical non-thinking thing. And so they have mutual exclusive properties. So let me just say right off the bat that I don't have a tidy solution to the mind-body problem. I admit that it's a problem. But the way I look at it, if you go back to my series that I did on epistemology, I mentioned the fact that you don't have to be able to answer every objection to your worldview in order to be rational in holding your worldview. Because almost any worldview you hold to, there's going to be anomalies that you don't know how to explain. There's going to be arguments against your position that you don't have answers to. But what you have to do is you have to weigh the arguments for and the arguments against, and which one ever is weightier, that's what you go with. In the case of these three worlds, since they all three have problems, one way to adjudicate between them is to pick the one that has the least problems. Now, in my mind, in reality, the idealism has the least of the problems, because the problem of solipsism doesn't strike me as being, it's not really a defeater of idealism in the same way that the hard problem of consciousness is a defeater for physicalism. Of the three views, I think idealism has the least problems. Physicalism has the most problems. Substance dualism is somewhere in the middle. So you would think that I would side with the idealist, but I don't. I mean, in spite of the fact that they have the least of the problems, I'm not the least bit inclined to subscribe to idealism for all the reasons that I gave, just because it's so wildly counterintuitive. I have this built-in intuitive awareness that my senses are giving me true information about a physical world that actually exists. And it would take quite a lot. It would take a lot of argument to overcome that intuition. So I basically just incline my belief to the one that seems the least problematic. There are a couple of of ways of characterizing the interaction problem. One of them is the way I characterized it before. If they don't have any properties in common, then how can they interact with each other? That to me is not the biggest of the problems, because that can be overcome just by the fact that our inability to explain how something happens is not a very strong reason to say that it can't happen. And so it seems to me like you can know that something happens before you can explain how it happens. I mean, there are all kinds of crazy things that happen in quantum theory that we don't know how they happen. We just know that they happen. The double exclusive experiment. Ooh, the what is it? The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. You watch a YouTube on that, that's weird. And there's really no good explanation for how that happens. What's the other? Entanglement, quantum entanglement. Supposedly, if you have two particles that are entangled, you can separate them as far as you want. And if you do a measurement on one, somehow that instantaneously affects the other. Now, there's no way to explain that. We know that it happens because experiment has proven that it happens. But how it happens, nobody really knows. So you can know that something happens without being able to give a good explanation of how it happens. Now, if we can allow that something is strange and bizarre as entanglement, if we can allow that happens, then I don't see why that to me seems every bit as problematic, if not more problematic, than the interaction problem. So the interaction problem doesn't strike me as being that problematic. The other way of characterizing the interaction problem is in terms of conservation of energy. This one to me seems like the more formidable of the ways of characterizing the interaction problem. So imagine you've got an electron just sitting there, and it's got, potential energy, and it's got, say zero kinetic energy because it's not moving. In reality, of course, it's moving. It has some kinetic energy. But say just take any object. It doesn't have to be an electron. So if it begins to move, all of a sudden it's got kinetic energy that it did not have before. So if you subscribe to the conservation of energy, energy is neither created nor destroyed. This energy had to come from somewhere. In the physical world, when one thing causes another, kinetic energy or potential energy from one thing is being transferred to the other thing, so that energy is conserved. In the whole system, there's no new energy, or nothing goes out of existence. So, but the mind is everything that the physical is not. And so the mind cannot be energy, so it can't have energy, so it can't impart energy to anything. And so if a particle goes from not moving to moving, now it has energy it didn't have before. Well, that energy has to come from somewhere else in the physical world. It can't come from the mind or a spirit or soul or whatever. And so if it begins to move, but that energy did not come from anything physical, then it had to have come from the mental. But if the mental is not physical, then how can you see the problem? Maybe I'm not explaining it very well, but hopefully you can see the problem there. One solution to this problem that I just kind of made up one time was maybe souls and minds are actually the only thing in existence that are capable of creating ex nihilo. In other words, bringing energy into existence out of nothing. In other words, and by out of nothing, I mean not out of pre-existing material, that just kind of produce it. And so if that would solve the interaction problem, but the only difficulty with that is it only explains causation in one direction. It explains how the mind can have causal influence over the brain, but it does not explain how the brain can have causal influence over the mind, unless you subscribe to the opposite thing. Like maybe when a mind perceives something, or the mind experiences something from the physical world, maybe energy is annihilated. Maybe it's created when causation is in one direction and it's annihilated in the other direction. I don't know. I just made that solution up. If that solution is true, then it would give us an additional reason to believe that whatever caused the universe is a mind. Because if the universe came into existence out of nothing, then whatever caused the universe to come into existence was probably a mind, because a mind, or at least a mind, would be the best explanation, since in that case, given that solution to the interaction problem, a mind would be the only thing we know of that's capable of producing something out of nothing. So if something caused the universe, if something immaterial caused the universe to come into existence out of nothing, then the best explanation is a mind, since the mind is the only explanation we could have. But I haven't gone that far yet. But anyway, those are my thoughts on the interaction problem. Basically, I acknowledge that it's a problem, but it seems to me, in light of all the arguments against physicalism and against idealism, dualism is still the better of the three views. It has the least of the problems. Physicalism seems to me to have the most of the problems. Idealism has the least of the problems in terms of defeaters, but it has other problems in terms of just seems extremely counterintuitive and irrational to accept. So I'm a dualist in spite of not having a really good solution to the interaction problem. But there's been a lot of literature on that. In the last video, I linked to a bunch of books, and one of the books is called The Soul Hypothesis. And I think there are at least 2 chapters in there that deal with the interaction problem. Now, I admit, a lot of stuff it says in that book are over my head. They're too difficult for me to understand. Maybe I could understand it if I spent a little bit more time on it. But if you want to read into it, I recommend that book, because maybe you're smarter than I am. Maybe you can get more out of it than I did. So anyway, that's all I have to say. And this really is the last video on this whole subject. So I'm going for the stop button.